It's my first time. Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Heather Hodges, the President and Ambassador-in-Residence at the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. We at CCWA are pleased to be partnering with the City Club today, and I'm doubly pleased to introduce our speaker, who is Vice President for New Initiatives and a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Aaron David Miller. For 2 decades, Aaron served in the Department of State as an analyst, negotiator, and advisor on Middle East issues to Republican and Democratic Secretaries of State. Between 2003 and 2006, he served as president of Seeds of Peace, an internationally recognized program in conflict resolution and coexistence. He has written 5 books, including his most recent, The End of Greatness: Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. So what leads a Middle East analyst to write about American presidential greatness? In an interview with NPR, Aaron explained, quote, "I've worked on the Arab-Israeli negotiations for a good many years, and I concluded, quite simply, that when in fact there were breakthroughs, it was a consequence of the fact that we had leaders who were masters of their political constituency, not prisoners of their political houses. Leadership, it seemed to me, represented the key to change," end quote. In his book, Aaron identifies the 3 C's of presidential greatness: crisis, character, and capacity. And he demonstrates why only 3 of our 44 presidents can be classified as great, and how we're unlikely to witness the rise of another great president. We'll hear more about the reasons why from him today. His articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and his column, Reality Check, appears weekly in Foreign Policy magazine. He's a frequent commentator on PBS, NPR, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and others. And I also would like to recommend, I get an email from the Wilson Center that is almost a collection of his various articles, and I've really enjoyed it. And I asked him how to get on that email list for you, and he said simply to contact him at the Wilson Center. If you look at their website, his email is there. So ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club, please join me in welcoming Aaron David Miller.
Heather, thanks so much, and I look forward at some point this year or early next in coming to the World Affairs Council to talk, as I promised you I would do. It's great to be back here. Either Jim Foster or Dan reminded me I'd been here 4 or 5 times before. Lindsay and I have been in Washington now for 40 years, which is an extraordinary, when I think about that, next year it will be 40 years. And yet I found myself today at National Airport at 5:30 or 5 a.m. in the morning. The lady at the desk said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going home." And I find myself saying that all the time, which is actually quite curious. You really can take the boy out of Cleveland, but you cannot, and I'm proud of this fact, take Cleveland out of the boy. I have, thanks. I really do mean that. It's an extraordinary place, and I'm proud to be from here. The more I get to see the rest of the country, particularly East Coast, I realize that we really aren't Midwestern, but whatever we are, we're quite different than certain other locations, Washington, New York. I have Mission Impossible. In 21 minutes, I promised Dan, I want to summarize some thoughts and conclusions about my book, Presidential Leadership, and then transition to make a few observations on the Middle East. I'm going to talk very quickly. I wish I had more time to devote to the book, which is provocative and controversial. People do not want to accept the basic assumption. I can understand why we want to give up on presidential greatness. I'll provide a clue to that during the course of my remarks. But let me start this way. And Heather actually helped me out by making one of my points. I worked for nearly a quarter of a century on the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace, and what I concluded from those many years traveling the negotiators' highway is that when we actually had breakthroughs, acts of real decision and political courage. It was always, without exception, when we had leaders that were masters of their political constituencies, as Heather noted and as I noted, not prisoners of their political houses. History bears this out. John Keegan, the great military historian, if he were here, would tell you that 6 men between the years 1920 and 1956 were responsible for most of the death, destruction, devastation, as well as the prospects in peace and prosperity for much of the Western world. It is illogical to have anyone tell you that leaders and people and individuals at all levels of the human enterprise don't count. They count for good and they can count for ill. But Keegan needs to be balanced against Marx. And here I'm talking not about Groucho Marx, but Karl Marx. And forgive me, Marx wrote in the 19th century. And Marx said, men, he said, writing in the 19th century, make history. But Marx said, rarely do they make history as they please. And that is the proper balance. It is the interaction between the individual, the agency of individuals, and the circumstances that they inherit or that they do create, which is largely responsible, in my judgment, for why things happen. Now, I looked at the issue of leadership and realized that there was a huge paradox here. We crave great leaders. We crave the giants of old, the transformative figures who changed our world. And yet, when you look around, we have, I would argue to you, a global leadership deficit. We have 5 great powers, the traditional great powers: Britain, France, China, the UK, and the United States. Not one of them, I would argue, has a leader that anyone could describe as transformative, with the mystique and the authority and the power to not just impose, but to create major change that could endure. 193 nations sit in the United Nations. 193. I'm not sure there is one leader there who would fit that category either. We have politicians. We have transactional leaders. We have men, Erdogan of Turkey, Vladimir Putin, who are good at holding on to their seats. Transactional politicians, but do we have transformational figures? That's why I think Mandela's passing was so important. I think Pablo Neruda, whatever he meant by this, embodies the passing of Mandela. Neruda wrote that it was a love poem. Your absence, he wrote, defines the horizon. That's what's happened, it seems to me. We crave the great leaders of old. We want the transformative leaders who are great and good as well. But where are they? And if we have a global leadership deficit, it's only a hop, skip, and a jump, I would argue, to the American political system and to the Energizer Bunny, the most dynamic, energetic agent in our political system, the presidency. It is the object of our affection, of our anger. We're obsessed with it. We can't get enough of our presidents. And unlike the 535 representatives or the 9 members of the Supreme Court, the Energizer Bunny, the president, is in session all the time. It's a 24/7 job. Unlike Congress or the Supreme Court, not in and out of session. Full time on the con. And the more I looked at how much we revere and at the same time are angry at our presidents, I began to see that there's a gap here. A gap between the presidents that we aspire to have and the ones we end up with. Part of this is basically built into the question of the difference between governance and politics. Politics is what people want. Governance is what they basically get. And every president, every politician is going to make promises that simply can't be delivered. So there will be a gap. It's built into the nature of the system. But the gap we face is large, I would argue, in large part because of the way we look at our presidents and the way they've turned out. We also, as Americans, are ambivalent about the nature of greatness in our own society. The Europeans do great. Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, Charlemagne. We don't, even while we aspire to greatness, we want greatness of a more common nature. That's why Jefferson is answering his own door, much to the dismay of the British ambassador, who was stunned by the fact that the President of the United States appeared at the White House door in his slippers. Or Grover Cleveland answering his own phone, or in the most extraordinary anecdote of all, Harry Truman, who, having left the White House in 1953, courtesy of a friend who bought him a New York Chrysler, packed up Bess with no advance team, no Secret Service, nobody else, and drove 1,200 miles up into Michigan, Ohio, and up and down the East Coast. Ate in diners, got pulled over by New Jersey highway patrolmen for speeding. And if the book is Harry Truman's Excellent Adventure, that was 1953. That's not that, well, I was born in 1949. It's not that long ago. So we demand greatness, but we want it of a kind of a common variety. I would argue, since we can no longer appreciate what greatness really is, we have a major problem in trying to evaluate it. Think about how many times during the course of a day you or I use the word great. We have emptied it of any significance or meaning or value that it actually has. Has a great day. He's a great tennis player. She's a great artist. Did you see that movie? It was great. It means absolutely nothing. I use the word, I bet you, 15 times every day. But how could we know great in our politics when we can't see it? What we've done, I would argue to you, is to transfer our appreciation of greatness from our political class, which has failed to deliver year after year, and I think you have the embodiment of it in the U.S. Congress, which according to one poll ranks somewhere below France and above NFL replacement refs. I mean, Congress has been in single digits for quite a while. So how can you evaluate what you can't see? We've transferred our appreciation of greatness from our political class to the wonderful world of athletics and entertainment. There, we have no problem appreciating greatness. And there, it's quite evident. And we pay a very small price. You don't have to invest in your athletes. Sometimes they disappoint, Tiger Woods and others. But you buy a ticket, expensive or not, and you get your money's worth. Our political class and our politicians, however, present a much greater and much more difficult challenge. An example, I briefed a bunch of military officers last year, roughly my age, all combat vets. And I asked them, what politician in your lifetime, they're all roughly my age, 65, 66, what politician in your lifetime would you attach the word great to? And I gave them 10 minutes to answer the question. They could not come up with a single individual. Now, I had an answer. It was evident. And I'm sure it's evident to you. In the last 50 years, the one person that comes to mind, not a president, but a politician, a leader of a movement, it was King. And when I said this to them, their response was, but that's not fair. Why? Because he died in 1968. And that's precisely the problem. We've lost any sense of how to appreciate greatness in our political class. We can't describe it, we can't appreciate it, in large part because it's not there. And frankly, we've accustomed ourselves to look for it in other places. The West Wing is a much more entertaining rendition of the American presidency than the real thing. It is fiction, frankly, becoming reality. The central argument of my book is, and there are three basic propositions. Number one, greatness was once real and measurable in our politics. We have three undeniably great presidents, one a century, one in the 18th, one in the 19th, one in the 20th. And it was real and measurable according to word and deed. Number two, since FDR, our undeniably last great president, we're 12 presidents and down without one. Now, we've had presidents who can accomplish great things, but in an undeniably great president, one that is appreciated by both R's and D's, one that rises above the narrow provincial fray of American politics and is appreciated by the nation as a whole? No. Now, it takes time to do this. Time's the ultimate arbiter of anything that's of value in this life. Good music, good marriages, good wine. It takes time to evaluate, but we're quite a ways away, and yet, I would argue, no undeniably great presidents. And the Republicans in 1951, having passed the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution in an effort to get even with Franklin Roosevelt, to ensure that there would never again be a president who could serve more than 2 terms, paradoxically ended up ensuring Roosevelt's greatness, because never again would a president ever be able to serve more than 2 terms. So FDR is the last undeniably great president. Greatness is gone, 12 presidents down and counting. Why is it gone? FDR established a high bar. Our media makes it very difficult, extremely difficult, to preserve the kind of mystique and authority and detachment that's necessary for greatness in the presidency. There's so many anecdotes I can tell about contemporary American presidents bringing themselves down to the level of daily banter. We talked about one, Barack Obama on the Jay Leno show. I understand why presidents go on late night TV, but there's a cost and a risk. You don't go on with Jon Stewart or Jay Leno and emerge, frankly, with the same sort of stature. And Obama with Jay Leno made a fundamental error. They got on the question of sports, and Obama said, and I quote, I bowled a 129. It's probably good enough for the Special Olympics. Obama found himself the next morning on the phone with Tim Shriver apologizing. So there's a risk to getting involved in popular culture, regardless of how smart it may be. And finally, why don't we want another great president? Because it is the basic theory of my book that undeniable greatness in American politics is driven, yes, by character and capacity. You have to have the right persona and you have to know what to do. But it's preceded by the first C. And without the first C, greatness of the kind I'm describing is virtually impossible. And that is crisis. Our undeniably great presidents all emerged in response to the 3 greatest crises the nation faced. And the reason greatness is a function of crisis is because the founders, in their ultimate wisdom, fearing both the royal governors and the king, designed a political system in this country that was not only bifurcated, it was trifurcated. It was a collection of shared and separated powers to avoid the aggrandizement of power, which they themselves in the late 18th century feared. And even while they thought they were great men, not of the same order. Franklin believed that great men ranked somewhere below hunger and disease and war. Then came great men. So the reality is, you want another great president? Fine. Buckle your seatbelt. Because what you're going to get in order to create this greatness, assuming we'd be lucky enough to have another great president, a he or she, emerge in the response to this crisis, is a crisis so hot, so inescapable, so undeniable, so nation-encumbering, that it forces the political elites to cooperate. It creates a measure of acquiescence that the public, too, will follow if the individual, the he or she, has the right character and the right capacity. They know what to do. And since the end of the Second World War, I would argue to you, we've had plenty of crises, but they have not been of the kind that I described. They have not been nation-encumbering. We fought the 2 longest wars in American history. By the way, they're both going on. In a country of 330 million people, with 0.5% of our public. 0.5% fought the 2 longest wars in American history. That's not the kind of nation-encumbering crisis. Had there been a draft in this country, frankly, I doubt whether Iraq and Afghanistan, even though in comparison to Vietnam, the casualty figures were much, much, much less. And in 1941, when my father went to war, there were 130 million people in this country. 16 million of them put on a uniform. It was, in fact, there was, in fact, a sense of shared obligation, a sense of shared sacrifice, and a sense of shared responsibility. There isn't any longer. And that, frankly, is the challenge of not my generation. That's the challenge of the next generation. My daughter, Jen, 34, At 21, she came to me and said, look, your parents had the Great Depression, World War II. They were national experiences that shaped the way they looked at the way we govern ourselves and the nature of the society. You, meaning me, had Vietnam, Watergate, the Civil Rights Movement. And then she turned to me in a plaintive voice and said, what do we have? What does my generation have? They have plenty of wonderful causes. The question is, what are the peculiarly national causes that encumber of choice the next generation? We're atomized. We're divided. It's quite clear. We were divided then on matters of race and class, no question. I don't want to go back to the old days. There was plenty wrong with the old days. But there's something missing here. Because if we have lost a sense of greatness as a people, no sense of shared sacrifice, shared sense of obligation, shared sense of responsibility, how do we expect, why would we even expect our politicians to measure up on that score? One more final point, and then I have 8 minutes to close with the Middle East. The presidency is the only office, and its sidecar, the vice presidency, the only office that we vote for, that we can all vote for. It's ours. The founders, although they never explained why, used a personal pronoun I in the Constitution of the United States. Does anybody know why? I understand the word we. The word we would be in the Constitution. It's in the Declaration of Independence. But why would a personal pronoun I be embedded in the Constitution of the United States? Does anybody know the answer? When someone asked me the question 5 years ago, I didn't know the answer. Why is the word I even mentioned in the Constitution? It's because the founders embedded in the document the inaugural oath. Now, why did they put it there? It's in Article 2. Why did they put it there? They put it there because the presidency is not owned even by the document, let alone the government. The presidency is owned by us. It's owned by us. And this conversation about the kinds of presidents we want and hope to aspire to, we need to have. I would only conclude on the president by saying the following. We have to stop expecting this illusory, ridiculous notion that a president is somehow a cross between Harrison Ford on Air Force One, who was literally portrayed as single-handedly combating Russian nationalist extremists on Air Force One, and a combination of some sort of superhero. This was not the way the founders imagined it, and it's not the way it should be. We have to stop expecting our presidents to be great and allow them to be good. Good in the sense that they are effective, good in that sense, good in the sense that they function within the law and they have moral sensibility, and good in the sense that they understand themselves. They have some sense of emotional intelligence and feel comfortable with who they are, because presidents get themselves into great degrees of trouble. Nixon and Johnson are two exceptions, are two representations, when in fact they allow their own demons and their own grandiosity to master and rule their own personalities. I have 6 minutes left, and I'm gonna basically summarize a few thoughts on the Middle East. None of our great presidents, with the possible exception of Roosevelt, had the pleasure, and Roosevelt toward the end of his term, he was dying in the spring of 1945, to get involved in what is now perhaps the most broken, angry, and dysfunctional region of the world, the Middle East. And if you look at the last 20 years of presidential involvement, you basically have two models. You have George W. Bush, a very risk-ready president, and you have, in reaction to George W. Bush, Barack Obama, in some respects, a very risk-averse president, dealing with a region which at the moment is melting down. It is a region, it is democracy-less, I would never, ever believe that I would say there'd be more democracies, more democratic polities, more real politics, and more stability in Africa than there would ever be in this region, but there is. 22 democracies have maintained their democratic character continuously since 1950. There are none in the Arab Muslim world. None, not one. And the trend lines, that's a headline. The trend lines aren't great either. Because for democratic life, you need leaders who are prepared to rise above their narrow corporatist, ethnic, sectarian affiliations to think about the interests of their country as a whole. You need institutions that are representative, legitimate, and authoritative, and are respected by people. And 3, you need some sort of safety valve mechanism where society can debate the most emotionally provocative issues without it leading to massive violence or breakdown in society. Despite all of our imperfections in this country, and there are many, we have created a big tent which enables us to do this. Modernity, the late Fuad Ajami said, means the capacity to be offended. And frankly, to be offended without having to resort to violence. In other words, we could have a whole separate conversation on this in the wake of Charlie Hebdo. But this is critically important. Freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. These things are absent in this region. You either have no governance in cases like Libya or Yemen or Syria, or bad governance in the case of Egypt, and even Iraq. We have core interests in this region. We have to attend to them. But in my judgment, we will not transform it. We have to get this notion of transformation out of our mind. We can't run away from it either. And I look at the two polarities here. Again, I worked for R's and D's. I voted for R's and D's. The dividing line for our foreign policy is not between Democratic and Republican. It's not between left and right. It's not between liberal and conservative. It's between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only thing that matters is which side of the line do you want America to be on. If you want America to be on the smart side, then you don't get your news from one single TV station. You don't spend the time while someone who you don't like or agree with is making their points. You don't spend the time while you're listening to them, trying to figure out how to refute what it is they're saying. You spend the time listening. It's the ultimate meaning of civility. Civility isn't politeness or courteousness. It's actually listening and engaging. We don't do that. And finally, it means borrowing ideas from wherever you can find them if they're smart and compelling. And in the Middle East, we need that. We need a strategy that is generational, a strategy that is nonpartisan in order to protect American interests. Let me just quickly, I have 2 minutes left. You can't transform and you can't leave. That's our dilemma in this region. You cannot fix the place. We've seen this between 2003 and 2011. And we cannot extricate ourselves from it. So if you can't transform and you can't leave, what do? Well, my solution is very practical. I have a fancy word for it. I call it transaction. That's what you do. You strip down to the core what your vital interests really are. You don't get distracted. You think before you act. If you use military force, you think about it as an instrument to achieve a set of clear objectives. There's no enterprise that's risk-free. No one can guarantee that a military action is going to succeed. But you certainly can have a sense of whether what you're trying to do is virtually unachievable. We engaged in 2 wars, both of which are still ongoing, which I would characterize, and not to demean, diminish, trivialize the men and women who died there, not to mention, those are the Americans, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans who died. I'm not trying to demean anyone's service. We engaged in a $1 trillion social science project which took the lives of more than 6,000 Americans, resulted in thousands who will never, ever recover from the injuries that they have received. We wasted trillions of dollars in what remains of American credibility. And the question that needs to be asked is, what? For what? What was the reason? And to this day, without blaming the R's or the D's, because ISIS is a creation of George W. Bush's efforts to restructure Iraq, which was reckless, and it's a creation of Barack Obama's eagerness to head for the exits in 2011. And I'm not here to blame either one of them. The question is, what was the end result? And I cannot answer the question. To this day, I cannot answer the question. It haunts me. I left government in 2003. I feel in some ways still responsible for this. I can't answer the question. So you strip down your core interests and you relentlessly pursue them in a way that's unsentimental and very clear. And here are our 4 core interests. Number 1, you protect the continental security of the United States. That is the most important interest we have. You preempt, you prevent another attack on the continental United States. In 14 years, we have not been attacked again successfully by a foreign terrorist organization directed from abroad in 14 years. And if you talk to the CIA analysts, they will tell you it's not ISIS that's the preeminent threat to our interests here. It's an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. We've spent 14 years trying to defeat Al-Qaeda, and you have spin-offs that are still very active and extremely smart and effective. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is the one. So you protect CONUS, continental United States, but you don't protect it in a way that's dumb. It's frankly enhanced counterterrorism, and that carries risks and prices. The use of drones offends people. It kills innocents. We've killed 3,000 people since 2001 by the use of Predator and Reaper drones. That's as many as died in 9/11. How much collateral damage, quote unquote, civilians, innocents were part of those figures? Hard to do the breakdown. The vast majority were not innocent. But that's a cost. That's interest number 1. Number 2, you wean yourself off of Arab hydrocarbons, which is happening. Truly, it is happening. Now, that's good for us, but energy independence doesn't guarantee energy security for one simple reason, because oil trades in a single market. So a major disruption in country X is going to have a financial and economic impact on country Y, and if it's severe and prolonged enough, it will come back here. That's already clear. Greece, not with respect to oil, but with respect to financial stability and debt is a classic example. The Greeks used to export extraordinary ideas and art. Now it's basically bad debt. But it's interconnected. The world is interconnected. So that's number 2. Number 3 is Iran. And let me be very clear here. This is not a question of demonizing Iran. If you could get an agreement that results in a smaller, slower, more transparent Iranian nuclear program, that would be a good thing. But do not think it is the end of the road. Do not think it's the end of the road. You have a state that is profoundly entitled and insecure. And that is a recipe for the possibility of always maintaining the option to weaponize. And Iran's objectives and ours in this region are fundamentally different. In Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and with respect to human rights. Truly different. And finally, allies. We need friends if you believe in transaction. You can't fix it, you can't leave, you need friends. And let me be very clear here. Our friends are not perfect. Trying to reconcile our values, our policies, and our interests are virtually impossible. We invade Libya, but not Syria. We supported Arab Spring in Egypt and not in Saudi Arabia. Don't look for consistency in the policy of any great power. You won't find it. It's in the job description of great powers to be inconsistent. They can afford to be inconsistent and hypocritical and anomalous and contradictory because they are great powers. And we surrounded by predatory neighbors to our north and south, and fish to our east and west, our so-called liquid assets, these two extraordinary oceans, afford us a measure of protection that no other country in the world has. So we can be inconsistent, and we will continue to be. You want Egypt to become a democracy? Good luck. You want to prevent military assistance, particularly in counterterrorism, because Egypt is not a democracy? Why? Hillary Clinton is now under fire because the Clinton Foundation accepted millions of dollars, even as she herself stood up as a legitimate proponent of women's rights. And the Clinton Foundation is taking millions from the Gulf states, who are hardly poster children, particularly the Saudis, for the emancipation of women. And yet we need Saudi Arabia. And even with the Israelis, who share many of our interests and clearly share our values, you've seen the strains. And the strains will not necessarily improve, because in life, where you stand has a lot to do with where you sit. And Washington and Jerusalem are sitting in two very different places. I've had two Israeli prime ministers, very different men, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yitzhak Rabin, literally tell me the same thing in person, which is this: don't lecture us about our security needs and requirements. You live in literally, using these words, you live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and we're sitting on top of a volcano. So you want perfect Israelis as partners? Forget it. You will not find them. And you will not find perfect Arabs to cooperate with either. But we need to find our way. Protect the United States, wean ourselves off of Arab hydrocarbon, try to keep the Iranians away from a bomb, and to the degree that we can, cooperate with our allies and our friends. And finally, in conclusion, I'm way over time, listen to what Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian, said 60 years ago. And he was talking about America. But be happy about it. Don't be sad. The best you're going to do in life is proximate solutions to insoluble problems. If we could get proximate solutions to the issues of race and class, debt deficit, dependence on hydrocarbons, decaying infrastructure, the deteriorating educational system, and I think we can in this country, we'd be way ahead of the game. And if the Middle East could get proximate solutions to insoluble problems, it would be a miracle in a land where miracles are supposed to happen. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are enjoying a forum with Aaron David Miller, Vice President for New Initiatives and Distinguished Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We encourage you to formulate questions for our panelist now, or for our speaker now, and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. Be sure to tune in to our Friday forums on 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our community partners for today's program are the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, the Northeast Ohio Consortium of Middle Eastern Studies, and the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. We thank you for your support. We welcome guests at the table hosted by Abraham Miller Graffiti Incorporated. We thank you all for your support. Be sure to join us on Monday, March 16, as we welcome Steve Dyer, Education Policy Fellow for Innovation Ohio, for a conversation on how and why Ohio has struggled to achieve excellence in its charter schools. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky. First question, please.
Thank you. When you were talking about greatness and presidents, you talked about great men. I haven't read your book, but I'm wondering if you could reflect on some writings that are out there from authors like Rebecca Traister, where she talks about how when we're looking at women candidates, there aren't an awful lot of leadership models of women. What have you come across in your research? What have you written about? And how do you think that this fact that we've had nothing but men to judge as far as whether we have great presidents or not affects the fact that our last 12 have not been great by your estimation?
I wish I could, but I can't. We are going to have a woman as president at some point. On this one, I mean, we could talk all day long about the superior qualities of women. Their infinite capacity to bear emotional and physical pain more than men. Their sense of judgment and prudence and wisdom. We can go on and on and on. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt was an extraordinary woman, truly extraordinary. And Franklin, despite the fact that he didn't look to her for romantic fulfillment, relied upon her anyway. I mean, it's an impossible question to answer. It's likely, and who knows, you're going to have a third Bush or a second Clinton in the White House within 22 months. Not inevitable, but if you ask me who the respective nominees would be, it'll be a third Bush or a second Clinton. So your proposition is going to be tested. I worked with Hillary when she was First Lady briefly. I attended Leah Rabin's funeral with her. I'm extremely impressed by her sense of judgment, her sense of humor, her sense of propriety. She kept us up all night on a 13-hour plane ride, wanting to know much about Israeli politics. She's arguably, other than Colin Powell, one of the few superstars to become Secretary of State. And I would argue to you, and I would argue the same thing, frankly, if you asked me about Jeb Bush, that both of those candidates would make, in my judgment, good presidents. Great presidents? Look, the fact that we're even talking about a third Bush or a second Clinton, I rest my case. And by the way, I do not ascribe to the notion that the very best among us, the true cream of American society, are so offended and alienated by what is required to run for president and become president that they choose simply not to participate. I don't believe this for a minute. The people who've held this office put themselves in the game, even the accidental presidents, who we didn't expect much from, the Harry Trumans and the LBJs, who by Roosevelt's cerebral hemorrhage and Lee Harvey Oswald's bullet basically made them president. The people who run for president are the ones who are running for president and who should be running for president, because they may not be perfect, but they have the basic instincts and qualities necessary to be in this arena. The ones who, frankly, wouldn't deign to participate don't deserve it. These people are not normal. They're not. And I don't say that in a negative way, but you cannot be normal and go through this process. You're fundamentally changed. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse as a consequence of it. That's what this office, I think, demands. So we may get a road test, frankly, of your proposition. Or maybe we won't. But at some point, the Republican, in its infinite wisdom, will do again what it did in 2008, and this time to make a female president of the United States. I would argue clearly it's long overdue.
Okay. Well, first of all, to honor the Middle East, I wore olive-colored clothing today, so I'm glad you got your 6 minutes to talk about it. So I'm wondering, in a possible effort towards greatness, I'm wondering if the efforts the last couple of years of Obama and Secretary Kerry towards achieving a Middle East peace settlement, do you think that they really thought they could get farther than they did at the time? Did they know something we didn't, or did they think they know something we didn't? And do you see significant political restraints from our system as getting in the way of that actually happening?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention this as a vital interest because for 25 years, I wrongly assumed that it was. And you know, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, they're right. Life's about learning. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about ownership. And if you asked me, forget Kerry and Obama, they are necessary, or an American President Secretary, they are necessary but not sufficient to reaching anything, and let me choose my words very carefully here, a conflict-ending agreement. Other things may be possible, but if you're talking about a conflict-ending agreement in which an Israeli prime minister stands before the Knesset and a Palestinian president before the Palestinian Legislative Council and says the following, peace is not here, it'll take a generation, that requires a transformation, but on the 5 or 6 core issues that drive our conflict, border security, refugees, Jerusalem, and finality of claims, we're done. No more claims to be adjudicated, no more irredenta and dreams and aspirations to be pursued. That, in my judgment, as I stand before you today, that is an aspiration. That is an unreal aspiration. Now, there may be real alternatives, but I do not see that. And I know that it will be possible when one thing exists that does not exist now, which is ownership. Okay? Michael Jackson said it in Man in the Mirror. You want to make a change in your life, the place to start is by looking in the mirror. That's where you start when you want to change. You don't blame somebody else. You look in the mirror and you look honestly. And once you accept the conclusions, then you can blame whoever else you want. Larry Summers or Tom Friedman, the two of them are still arguing over who claimed responsibility for this line, but it is a profound piece of life's philosophy. In the history of the world, one of them said, and I think neither of them frankly invented it, in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. Do you know why you don't wash rental cars? It's very clear. Because you care only about what you own. It may be a sad comment on the human tradition, but you care only about what you own. There is insufficient ownership on the Palestinian side to pay the price. There is insufficient ownership on the Israeli side to pay the price. And that ownership is driven by two things. It's very simple. Pain, insufficient quantities, and prospects of gain, insufficient quantities. Every breakthrough in this region began without the U.S., driven by pain and gain. And the locals made a calculation that because of incentives and disincentives, pain and gain, they had to change their behavior. Barack Obama will not do it. First of all, you have to separate out Barack Obama from John Kerry. John Kerry really believes in this. He also wants in, and I say this with no sense of cynicism, he also wants in to the Secretary of State Hall of Fame. And the last two, Henry Kissinger and James Baker, I worked for the latter, deserve to get in because they took on an enterprise that normal human beings like me and you know is really hard, and they owned it. But they did it with the help of Arabs and Israelis. Right now, and I don't care who wins on March 17, and that process, by the way, is going to drag out for weeks. If you're staying up on March 17 to figure out who won the Israeli elections, you're going to have to wait a while. Because I suspect, it's prolonged coalition negotiations, unless there is some sort of significant surprise, which none of the polling indicates. It's ownership. Without ownership, it's not going to happen. Because why would anybody want to take these decisions unless they had to? Sadat died because of what he did. Rabin was murdered because of what he did. They paid for these things with their lives. This is really, we've had a fair share of assassinated presidents. But politics in this region really is existential. It's not existential here. I mean, I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. This is a passion for me. It's a commitment to me. But let's be clear. You know, morally, I have no right or no authority to somehow tell the Arabs and the Israelis what to do, because if they don't come to these decisions on their own, just like reform in the Arab world, no way made in Washington is going to answer the mail. So that's what you really need. In 22 months, I do not believe it is possible to produce a conflict-ending agreement. Something, given if there's proper investment on the part of the Israelis and Palestinians, may well be possible. A serious process of negotiation that actually gets somewhere. I mean, I wrote an article in 2010 called The False Religion of Middle East Peace and Why I am no longer a believer. It got an enormous amount of attention because I had put 25 years into believing. And it's not that I stopped believing, but what I refuse to do, I haven't abandoned hope. I can't do that. I have a 34-year-old daughter and a 32-year-old son. I occupy a tiny space on this planet for a very short period of time. I have no moral authority to tell my kids never on any issue. I don't have that right. But I refuse any longer to entertain the illusions that I entertained for a very long time. Those illusions in war making and even in peacemaking are very, very costly. I'm not running for anything. Clarity is important to me, and honesty even more so. And that's what you need to even begin to try to do this deal. I'm sorry to drone on, but you dropped a nickel on me.
Mr. Miller, allow me to be a little bit personal. I have heard you, if you've been here 4 times, I've probably heard every one of those. And each time that you've spoken, I found you to be very informative and even-handed in your talks. And I have noticed over the years a change in your philosophy when you first came to the last time you were here. But one thing has always been in the back of my mind. How relevant could you have been, were you in the State Department, or were you respected in your negotiation when your family, which we love in Cleveland, Ohio, has been so out and forward as to Israel? Didn't your relevancy, wasn't it to some extent affected? Didn't the Arabs, the Palestinians who you were talking to, didn't they know anything about your background?
No, it's a fair question, and I often ask myself, I ask myself that question. The enterprises, the successful enterprises that I participated in, and the last 2 successes we had, the first was Madrid under Jim Baker, when all of his advisors, every one who worked on the Arab-Israeli negotiations happened to be Jews, every one. But that really was inconsequential, and do you know why? Because you had a Secretary of State, probably the best negotiator, the best actor, who had the confidence of the president, who understood how to use his staff. And when the Arabs and the Israelis heard U.S. positions, it was from James Baker or Bush 41. The second success were 2 interim agreements that we reached under a Democratic administration, both actually with Benjamin Netanyahu, which was really quite extraordinary. One, the Hebron Protocol in 1997, and a second at the Wye River Conference. And Netanyahu remains to this day the only Likud prime minister that has ever surrendered, although quite slight, a piece of West Bank territory. It's not a campaign poster for Benjamin Netanyahu, believe me. That agreement was, those 2 agreements were done under Bill Clinton when, again, most of his advisors on the Arab-Israeli issue happen to be Jews. So, you know, I'm not sure how to answer the question. I mean, in one respect, it's what counts is the effectiveness of the name and reputation of the United States and the balance of interests that is struck in the agreements. And on the other, what counts even more than that is the investment of the Arabs in the Israelis themselves. My wife, Lindsay, keeps a folder of comments, newspaper articles about me personally over a 25-year period. They come from Jews, they come from Christians, they come from Muslims, they come from, there's a variety of comments, all negative, by the way. The worst comments come from Jews, without a doubt. So there is a certain, there's a certain truth to your point, but the greater truth, I think, I mean, I could go on and tell you that, well, you know, the fact that I understand Israel and that I'm Jewish gives me a greater sensitivity and greater sensibility on the Israeli side. But that's just half of the story, right? Because frankly, if you're going to have an agreement, you're going to have to reconcile the needs of both sides. But success comes, in my judgment, and it is the world's greatest ideology, not capitalism, not nationalism, not even democracy. Success is the world's greatest ideology because it generates power and constituents. Success comes through effective diplomacy and decisions made by presidents and secretaries of state who are wise enough and smart enough, and I would argue at times under Bill Clinton, he was not, to reject the advice of advisors, Jewish and non-Jewish, who had so much invested, not in one side's needs or the other, but in the desirability, the inevitability, the feasibility of peace, that they got too far ahead of themselves. That's how I would answer the question. Yeah.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have enjoyed a forum with Aaron David Miller, Vice President for New Initiatives and Distinguished Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.